And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by OpEdNews.com, available on Pacifica Radio, Progressive Radio Networks, and iTunes at OpEdNews.com/podcasts. My guest for this show is Tim OReilly, and I got to say, I've been really excited to have Tim on the show. Welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
Tim launched the first commercial website. He's probably the most influential tech publisher. He's organized incredible conferences, bringing together some of the most influential digital leaders. He's credited being one of the web's earliest evangelists and helping create the terms Web 2.0, open source, and the maker movement. And he's the author of a new book, WTF, What's the Future and Why It's Up to Us. Great book, by the way. Really enjoyed it. Just loaded with really good information. So with the book, you offer a very hopeful vision with caveats. And basically, you say that WTF can be one of incredulity and amazement or disgust. And I think one of your goals is to help us make it so that the future is one of hope and positivity. So you wrote in the book, the future is the outcome of millions of intersecting vectors which add up in unexpected ways. The art is to pick out important vectors and weave a net from them in which to catch a view of the future. And hopefully we'll have, during this conversation, a chance to get a feel for how people can do that. Now, I call my show the Bottom Up Show because I believe we're in a transition from a predominantly top-down culture to a more bottom-up one, that the internet and smartphones, technology have all catalyzed to move us more towards being more bottom-up, which I think is the way we were before civilization and indigenous culture. So my hope is in this conversation, you can cast some light in some ways on bottom up and top down and how that applies, like particularly to algorithms, for example, open source, things like that. So, but let's start with a story. Can you tell us a story that maybe represents some important lesson?
Well, since you've raised this question of bottom up versus top down, you know, there's a recurring story that we see again and again, which is that some new technology comes along, it's profoundly democratizing to a new group of people. And over time, power consolidates, and we get back to a top-down society, which becomes extractive and which is less vibrant for ordinary people, and they go somewhere else. And so we see then the process repeats. In my book, I use the analogy of a fitness landscape, which is an idea from evolutionary biology. And it's very hard to migrate from a sort of a fitness peak to the next one. Usually people who are down in the valley kind of can get up to the next peak more quickly. So here's the story. There's this new technology that comes along called the personal computer. And all of a sudden, like ordinary people like you and me can have our own computers. You know, we're both old enough to remember when computers were these things that were in these big, air-conditioned rooms. They weren't just the size of refrigerators. Like the disk drives were the size of refrigerators. The whole room was the computer. And all of a sudden, teenage kids could have a computer, and they went wild. And guess what happened? 10 years later, here's Microsoft at the top of the heap, telling people what they could and couldn't do. And so everybody goes, well, this isn't really interesting anymore. And they go off and they kind of discover, it wasn't quite 10 years, but a little bit more than that. They go off and discover the World Wide Web. Happens all over again. And then, here we are 15 years later, and, the industry is dominated by giant companies, and everybody's kind of looking for the new bottom up.
Yeah, it's true. I just attended a conference on platform cooperativism.
Yeah.
And they're really dealing with just the kind of thing you're talking about here. This transition from bottom up back to top down.
Yeah, it's always a battle ongoing. I think it's a mistake to think that it's either or. There's this great line from Wallace Stevens, who's a poet of the nature of reality, and he talks about reality and the imagination. And he kind of talks about how the realist kind of strips away all the imagination, and kind of sees things as they are, and then he says, but then the tragedy begins again in the yes of the realist spoken because he must say yes, because beneath every no lay a yes that had never been broken. And, so like the imagination reasserts itself and says, no, we're not satisfied with this, bare reality of the so-called realist.
Yet you finish your book with a quote, your words. Now where did I put it? It's that creativity. Here it is. Moral choice, not intelligence or creativity, is our greatest asset. That's kind of where you conclude the book.
Yeah, the thing that I'm really trying to get across, throughout the book, I mean, the most important part of the title is not what's the future, but the why it's up to us. And, there's so many ways that I could say, well, these ideas kind of came together. But there's one thread that for me started with a conversation I had with Bob Putnam, the author of Bowling Alone and other books like that. And he said, all of the great advances in our society have come when we invested in other people's children. He was talking about the role of education in the advance of society. And I quote that in the book, but it got me really thinking. There's also a wonderful essay in Foreign Affairs by Mark Blythe that I reflect on. There are these turning points in history when people really do make different choices, and they make an incredible difference. We stopped sending kids into the factories and fields, and chimneys, in the Industrial Revolution, and sent them to school. And it's after we did that we see the explosion of productivity. It's not actually in that dark days of the Industrial Revolution. It's in the lighter days when we went, let's actually share the fruits of this productivity. And then same thing happened with the Agricultural Revolution, when industrial agriculture came into play. And you watch from 1909, 9% of high school age kids in the U.S. went to high school. In 1935, only 25 years later, it's up to 70%. And that's basically people saying to themselves, wow, our kids aren't going to be needed on the farm. We need to educate them for the jobs of the future. And this choice that people made to tax themselves and to create this new institution across the nation, that's incredible. And I also look at this, the story of choice in how we dealt with 2 successive world wars. World War I, this incredible devastation, and the winners punished the losers, created more devastation. We went into, we had this, plutocratic society where the extractive, lords basically made sure they tried to get their money back from the people who disrupted their business. And, we went into this Great Depression, hyperinflation in Germany. We end up with the rise of fascism and another world war. Right? After World War II, we made totally different choices. We rebuilt our enemies. People who had attacked us and savaged them, we basically rebuilt their countries. We invested in them. And we created this, basically, several generations of incredible prosperity. And then we went, well, we really don't want to do that anymore. We withdraw from, that investment in other people, and it's kind of like, well, we're just going to try to make our economy more efficient for people who are, who are making lots of money already. And guess what? The whole system starts to crumble. And we see what we're seeing, rise of fascism again. We're seeing, incredible wealth inequality. We're seeing stagnation of growth And it's pretty clear that our economic storytelling is wrong, and we're making the wrong choices. And so, in some sense, that history should inform our thinking about technology as well. Because there are two lessons from technology. One is it can help people in power extract more from the system and create more power. Again, this goes back to this is the thread from my story about Microsoft and Google as sort of to the extent to which they become extractive companies rather than creative platforms for society, for others to flourish. But it's also writ large at our financial system. Is it supporting an extractive economy, or is it a platform for a rich, diverse, bottom-up economy? And so to me, kind of like your bottom-up story, the really interesting question, and I got into this is a little separate from the book, but I got into a debate with Reid Hoffman, who has a book called Blitzscaling, about why startups need to raise a lot of money, grow really fast, because that's the way to success. And I said, well, look, Reid, I really get that. That's a pragmatic approach, but there's only so many companies that are going to get to this global scale. What happens to the rest? And to me, the answer has to be the companies that win the race to become global scale platforms have to be a fertile ground for everybody else. They can't be like, well, we're just going to get as much as we can for ourselves. We have to create value for others. And so I've really gotten onto this, my next book, if I write one, is really actually about the economics of value creation versus value distribution.
And you just ran a conference on an economics conference. How'd that go? Can you talk a little bit about that, and what's your vision that came out of it?
Well,
coming out of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been, kind of on this notion of we need to rethink the economy. And in one sense, it's not a new thing. I mean, the design pattern of technology in the economy has always been that, the economy and companies flourish when they use technology to do more, to make everybody richer, and not when they use technology to do the same thing more cheaply. And we have built a lot of incentives into the system, in our financial system, to tell companies, you can make a lot of money just by doing the same thing more cheaply. And of course, over the long run, I think the companies that do more will win. And I think retail is a great example of this. You think about the big box stores where they basically say, well, we'll get rid of all the people. And you go to a place like Home Depot, you can't find anything. There's nobody there to help you. And then you look at the Apple store, where they kind of put lots of people in the store, became the most productive retail stores in the world. You look at another approach with Amazon, where they didn't put in lots of people, but they basically built this new class of workers, software programs, which are actually workers who are helping us to find our product, to check out. And then they basically put people to work in a different part of the value chain, in warehouses, in delivery, so that you now can get your products in some categories and in some places same day, and you kind of think about that. And, Amazon keeps doing more, not just it's like when they put 45,000 robots into their warehouses between 2014 and 2016, they added 250,000 people, because they were trying to move more products faster. And there are companies who, their whole model is, well, we'll put in the robots, we'll get rid of the people, we'll have a fatter bottom line. And they're going to lose long term. But short term, that short-term optimization is incented by the way our economy.
Oh, wait, just to be clear, you're saying that people who think they're going to use robots to get rid of workers, they're going to end up losing. But look what happened to Amazon, where they added so many workers, right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, Amazon's
and what you're saying in the book is basically a lot of people are afraid that automation is going to kill a lot of jobs, and people are not going to have work. And you offer a very, very much more hopeful perspective on that, which you're fleshing out.
Yeah, I think it's hopeful both from the point of view of there are entrepreneurs who are showing us the way, and it's also hopeful from the point of view of that when you make better choices, you have better outcomes. So there's a lot of opportunity. It's not hopeful in the sense that I think it's inevitable in any way that things are going to end up that way. I mean, there's a very clear and strong scenario possible in which, our economy continues down the path of the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and we have an economy that's really optimized for producing luxury goods for a small number of people, while everybody else, life sucks. There were thousands of years of that, in the Middle Ages. We could have thousands of years of that again. Not just the Middle Ages, but through all of prehistory. Democratized abundance is a relatively recent phenomenon of the last few hundred years, and we could turn away from it. And we have to actually, if you think like a scenario planner, which is something I always try to do. Scenario planning, you try to imagine some wildly different futures, and then you look for news from the future, which is telling you which of those scenarios is more likely to come true. That's that sort of weave a net through which you can see the future quote that you read. When we imagine, the future, I think we need to imagine bad futures as well as good futures. We have to ask ourselves then what things we can do to influence more of one and less of the other.
But I think that one thing you do in the book that really was helpful to me is you basically say you got to look at things in a current context, not just with the judgments of the past.
Yeah.
Talking about jobs and augmented workers and different categories of workers. I think that's really interesting, important material that you covered. Could you go over that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think that the idea of the augmented worker is sort of central to my thinking. When we think back to the first industrial revolution, people could produce vastly more output with the aid of machines. They could do things that were impossible. You kind of imagine, I always think about this because, you have this Luddite rebellion. And I have to say, by the way, if you dig into the Luddite rebellion, they weren't actually anti-technology. They were basically saying exactly the same things as the people who did Occupy Wall Street, which is, we want our share, of the fruits of productivity. We want to get on board. We don't want to be left behind. And it was through a series of struggles that you actually got a productive working class. There's an interesting book on this called The Rise of the English Working Class that I'm reading now. But they couldn't imagine that you would use these machines. They weren't there with these machines. But here we are 100 years on, a couple hundred years on, and we literally dig a tunnel from England to France. We land on the moon. We fly through the air. We bring vast, commodities from all over the world in these ships so cheaply that you can actually sometimes get stuff cheaper from halfway around the world than you can get it than you can grow it local, right? So all these things were unimaginable, and we augmented our physical capabilities, and now we're doing it again by augmenting our mental capabilities. So think about a company like Google. They're literally running billions of ad auctions a second. Every Google search has all these incredible calculations to come up with a unique configuration of ads, figure out who wins the top position. It's like nothing that could be done without this immense cognitive augmentation. And of course, the ads are much more targeted, much more useful. Search results, obviously, also the result of this incredible cognitive augmentation. Nobody could, you think about, again, you and I grew up in a time when if you wanted to find out something really obscure, you could go to a research library and talk to the librarian who would kind of go, do a bunch of searches for you and come back with some books. And, over the course of a day or two, you might find some really useful sources. Incredible cognitive augmentation where we can now learn things almost immediately. And we're starting to apply these. I talk in the book a lot about what we learn from services like Lyft and Uber. Again, the cognitively augmented driver who can find a passenger at some random location, because of the synchronization between these phones that both know exactly where the people are. The old taxi cab driver has to either be called and summoned to a particular address, or they drive randomly around the streets till they find someone. And now we can actually literally match up in real time. That's cognitive augmentation. It's also cognitive augmentation that somebody who's not an experienced taxi driver knows their way around has an app that says, oh yeah, I can actually figure out how to take anybody anywhere, because I'm going to get turn-by-turn directions. And so I keep looking now when I think about the future of work, I think, well, wow, what are all the other areas that could take cognitive augmentation? And how would we do the world differently if we had these cognitive augmentations? So healthcare is a great example. Right now we have a factory model where there's all this expensive equipment in one place. First of all, the equipment's being miniaturized. We're not going to be that far from the Star Trek tricorder kind of, we'll scan people.
Let me throw in one more piece, because you talk a lot about, in my exploration of bottom up, the two words that come up the most are democratization and collective. And you talk a lot about collective and collective intelligence, for example.
Yeah.
How about putting the two of them together?
I like to go off here.
Collective intelligence and augmented person. Where do you see that?
Well, definitely. I mean, so many of the apps that we have today and the services really are based on collective intelligence. That was sort of the central insight of the work that, I wrapped the term Web 2.0 around. Was the fact that all of the companies that survived the dot-com bust in some way or other had figured out how to harness the collective intelligence of millions of users. Google does that, Amazon does that. It was part of their edge. I think, and clearly, if you look at a service again, like Lyft or Uber, again, they're creating a new way to organize people into an ad hoc collective, that's very different from the kinds of formal company organizations we use in the 20th century. We haven't yet figured out how to make those fair, which is why you have movements like platform cooperativism. How do we actually get this so that the rewards of this collective don't just go to the owners of the machines?
Well, I hope that what you're saying, that company developers are going to do better if they share the wealth and if they make it so that the users benefit too. I think that's going to, hopefully that will lead to creation of companies that compete with the current giant platforms and that do better than them. That would be really nice to see.
Yeah, the one thing that I would just say, I'm not hopeful about a naive platform cooperativism. And when I say there is, I've had this debate in the realm of open source software. Because early on, we had a situation where people who were inventing open source software were doing things that nobody else was doing in some sense. Sure, there were other operating systems, but Linux was the first operating system that could be built by people, could be shared by people. MySQL database that was optimized for this new thing, the web, the World Wide Web, distributed hypertext. All these things were created, given away, and then we built on top of them. But there were some open source projects that never actually had as big an impact. What were they? They were, open office. We're gonna do what Microsoft does. We're just gonna have it be free and open source. The GIMP. We're just gonna do what Photoshop does, but it can be free and open source. So I think that there's a mistake. There's already a big entrenched competitor delivering pretty good service. We want to do that, but we're going to do it as this cooperative. I think that the cooperatives have to, start fresh. And I think another one I look at here, that's not to say that you can't convert to a co-op. But again, I think even about like a co-op like REI. They invented a new category, they were one of the leaders in this sort of outdoor wear thing. It's like REI Patagonia. They were kind of making this new world, and so they could make new rules.
And REI is a cooperative.
Is a co-op, yeah. And actually, I'm really fascinated by co-ops, and it's something I want to spend a lot more time thinking about, because they illustrate really powerfully the way we do capitalism in our current financialized model is not the only way to do it. You know, like REI, there's a couple of $1 billion in revenue. It's a company that's one of the most successful competitors in its space. Its same-store sales are better than, you know, other, you know, stores. Their growth is better. The only thing that's not better is they're not making more profits, because they give them back to their employees in the form of higher wages and benefits, and to their customers in the form of rebates. And they don't keep that much.
Well, I'm smiling because you've talked about Apple and how
Yeah.
Apple's making so much money that they don't have to be making that much except for their stockholders. And you've pointed out that they could be paying those great store workers who do an incredible job in increasing the value of the brand. They could be paying them a decent wage, in which they're not. And I love that you say that about not.
Yeah, and if they did, you know, they would bring up the whole rest of the economy, because they would basically be signaling that, hey, we should be paying more to retail workers. And, you know, there's plenty of money there. I mean, there's plenty to go around. It's just not going around in the right way. You know, it's like, why should Apple be saying, we're going to spend $100 billion on stock buybacks to make Carl Icahn a little richer, which is kind of what happened, you know, and all through these companies, just like literally borrowing money to buy back their stock, to pump it for some, quote, investor who's not really an investor, who's a gambler and a manipulator. And the thing I've been thinking about there is, so, I mean, in one sense, so kind of coming back to this idea of, you know, yes, I want co-ops, but I want co-ops that figure out, you know, that are not invidious co-ops. They're like, wow, look, Uber and Lyft are doing this great thing. We got to do that. Again, if you can pull it off, great.
Invidious? I'm not clear.
Well, just envious. You know, you kind of like, you know, I just sort of always felt like, you know, Open Office and the GIMP were in open source software. It wasn't like we're gonna. You know, it was like we want to make the thing that somebody else invented, rather than we want to make this new thing. And I certainly think that, you know, there are wonderful co-op opportunities for, you know, like drivers, for example, in a bunch of cities, you know, that are already dense. But I think it's going to be hard to make that work, you know, nationwide, you know, because, you know, there's sort of a coordination problem and a scale problem. You know, the reason why these companies are losing money is because they have to invest a lot of money to build two sides of a two-sided market. And
the customers and the drivers.
Yeah, the customers and the drivers. So I think it's going to be a challenge in that market. I could be wrong, and you know, there may be places where it's really going to work. But I think the right way to do it is to find new markets and new opportunities that are not already got heavily capitalized dominant players that you're trying to unseat. You know, because for all that, you know, again, going back to the history of open source, and that's why I talk so much about it in the book, you know, Linux, everybody thought,
before you wait, describe open source, because a lot of my listeners are not going to know what you mean by it. What is open source?
Okay, so open source software is software that is basically the source code is distributed freely under a license that means that anybody can modify it or use it for any purpose. This is in a stark contrast to, say, the proprietary software model that was used by Microsoft, which is they were literally forcing people to pay extra for it even if they weren't using it. So it was bundled with every computer. You're kind of like using your control over the software to exert control over the industry. Open source was like, no, you can do anything you want with this.
And you organized the first conference on it.
Yes, I did.
Name it, and you talk in your book and you talk at conferences and about how just about everybody uses open source because it's
and that's really the point that I wanted to make, was that a lot of the initial activism about free and open source software was, we're going to replace, this is kind of the same as this platform cooperativism story, we're going to replace the incumbents. You know, Linux, which was this free operating system developed by Linus Torvalds originally. Linux is going to replace Windows. MySQL is going to replace Oracle and Access and so on. And it didn't really work out that way. What actually happened was that Linux and MySQL and the various languages like Perl and Python, all of which were, free and open source.
Which you've published the books on how to do.
That's right, which I published books on how to do. Were all used to build the next generation of technology, sites like Google and Amazon. And that, kind of is sort of the story. You have to leapfrog, the current model. You can't just kind of say, oh, well, we're going to take this new technology and we're going to have a cooperative version of the old thing, because in the end, there were companies, Red Hat was a company that, said, try to commercialize Linux, but they never really, got anywhere near the scale of Microsoft and its old model. But guess who did? Google. They basically just used that software to build a new thing where they could be first. It reminds me a little bit of this wonderful book called I think it's the 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing by Riaz and Trout. And their first law of marketing is be first. And their second law of marketing is if you can't be first, create a new category in which you can be first. And their example for that was everybody knows the first person to fly across the Atlantic. That was Charles Lindbergh. Nobody knows the second. Everybody knows the third. That was Amelia Earhart, right? And it's just kind of a really good point. It's like Google basically figured out how to use all that stuff. Amazon figured out how to use all that stuff to build a new thing. And I think the opportunity that we have, when I look at, the lessons of Uber and Lyft, you kind of go, well, what would on-demand, okay, let's just assume that, taxi service is done. It's not completely finished, but like it's going to be really hard to get in there. But what could we use on-demand for? Like, what about thinking about disrupting healthcare with it, for example?
Now, when you talk about on-demand, you're talking about the fact that somebody can go to the Uber app, take out a cab, and in minutes, an independent contractor who is using the Uber app will use their navigation software to get to you in just minutes. That's on-demand.
Right. And I think about, like, how would we restructure healthcare if instead of having to go to the doctor, you called and a community health worker came and showed up at your house? We already know a couple of things. One, Uber's already run some experiments with that. They every fall they have a thing where you can Uber for a flu shot, and a nurse shows up at your house and gives you the flu shot. It's kind of a publicity stunt. But think about that. We actually know that the heaviest users of healthcare services that deliver the most cost are people who don't deal with chronic conditions and then they show up in the emergency room, sometimes 3 times a week, right? There are people who show up in the emergency room 3 times a week, and they cost the system enormous amounts of money. And now imagine that you say, well, we have we built a fleet of community health workers who come help, deal with people. You got to take your medication. You got to do, and we have monitoring because we now have telemedicine. People are able to well, and maybe it's literally somebody's, I've fallen and I can't get up. You can, there's all those sort of little, buttons that elderly people wear, but now we can have sensors in the house that basically say, oh, whoa, John fell over and he's not getting up, call for help. You can imagine all kinds of interesting ways that on-demand could be used in healthcare.
And they wouldn't even have to necessarily show up. They could be people working through apps as well.
So that's right, exactly. And there's telemedicine in there. Anyway, and I would suspect that there's going to be a lot of invention like that in healthcare. Where we're doing healthcare hotspotting, using big data to identify heavy utilizers, figuring out, hey, it's worthwhile to go, put monitoring equipment in their home to have a person on call for them, because it'll actually. Because the way the reimbursement works now in some of these systems, if you save money, you get to keep some of it. And so there's now starting to be healthcare practices that are organized around keeping people out of the emergency room by delivering them better service. And that's very much that, we'll do more, not less.
So I want to, you are literally an incredible leader in the tech world. You've had an incredible role, yet you studied the classics at Harvard. You taught at Esalen, a place where people explore consciousness. I need to do a station ID, and when we get back, I want to talk to you a little bit about how that contributed to where you are now. So this is the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by OpEdNews.com, available on Pacifica Radio, Progressive Radio Network, on iTunes, and available to download at opednews.com/podcasts. And the show is called The Bottom Up Show because we believe we are transitioning from a top-down to a more bottom-up culture that's been catalyzed by the internet. And I'm talking to Tim O'Reilly, who is a pioneer in the internet. He's a publisher, probably the biggest publisher of tech books that teach people how to create the technology in the internet. He's run incredible conferences that have broken new ground, and he's got a new book out, What's the Future and Why It's Up to Us.
Yeah, let me also mention that, a lot of people still think of us as a publisher and a conference producer, but the biggest part of our business is actually an online learning platform called Safari. We started in 2000 as an ebook platform. But really now our hottest product on the platform is live online training, where we're literally providing networked instruction on technology topics. But, we're really, a lot of ways, we are at bottom, an education company. We've used books, we use conferences, we use online training, but all of it's around teaching the skills that companies and individuals need to become more effective in the 21st century.
Okay, so what about that background, that Harvard Classics degree and teaching at Esalen? Teaching at Esalen? I've had a couple friends who have taught there. It's a really cool place, but it's kind of far from tech in some ways.
Well, that was before the tech world as we know it today existed. I was 18 years old. This is 1973. I had worked with a guy named George Simon, who was trying to develop a new language for consciousness. I talk a little bit about this in the book, this idea of language as a map. And I basically, worked very closely with him and co-taught with him at Esalen in 1973. He died in an accident that year. My woman who was later my wife and I continued to teach there for a number of years. But I eventually, got into tech because one of the people who was in my classes was a programmer who got asked to write a manual, and I said I'd help him out. And one thing led to another. We started a consulting business. He never did learn to write, so we broke up the partnership. But I continued, and then, from the consulting business, I developed the publishing business. From the publishing business, I developed the conference business. And then shortly thereafter, the online learning business.
But what about the Harvard part? Where's that fit into your big? I think you've got a really incredible big picture view of the world, and you offer maxims throughout your book that are bold, that are just fabulous.
I'm glad you think so. Part of this work with this guy, George Simon, about the evolution of consciousness, again, I was a teenager when I first met him, was really around the sort of stages of human consciousness. He had this idea that there would eventually be this global consciousness, and that the last change, major change in global consciousness, it really happened, in the middle of the first millennium BC. In places like Greece, where we sort of the modern concepts of rationality and so on, then the mind as we think of it today kind of came into focus. There's a wonderful book by a guy named Bruno Schnell called The Discovery of the Mind, and it's really contrasting the way that thinking is represented in Homeric Greece with how thinking is represented only three centuries later. Literally when Odysseus has an idea, the god places that idea into his liver, his thumos. It's like not at all what we think of as how you think. The description of colors is different. Just like this massive change. And then you look at, Socrates, and he's talking about what is justice, what is truth, these abstract concepts. And, there's this whole new way of thinking. And so I was fascinated by that, and it connected. So I went to study classics at Harvard because I was just sort of interested in kind of the birth of the modern mind. And then I kind of moved away from some of that work, but it was sort of ironic that though I was no longer teaching this, sort of 70s woo-woo version of global consciousness. By the way, it wasn't really woo-woo. There's really some real substance to it. But here to rediscover that in the form of technology-mediated global consciousness, that it was not something that came through, things like the harmonic convergence, all the 1970s and 80s kind of spiritual, Teilhard de Chardin, noosphere. It really literally was technology got better at connecting us faster. And we really started to build these applications that are global mind applications. Google, with billions of people, contributing, taking data, and we have this machine that learns from all of us at once. Every time we click on a link, Google learns from it. Every time we make a link, Google learns from it. That's a collective intelligence, application. Twitter, news and information and misinformation travel around the world in seconds. So we've actually built, a global superorganism. I actually have the idea in the book that in some sense maybe the future AI is not like a separate intelligence from us. It is us connected and augmented. In some sense, we're the microbiome of the AI. Google's an AI, Facebook is an AI, financial markets are an AI. All with the synthetic electronic connective tissue, brain tissue, but we influence it just like the microorganisms in our bodies and our influence our thinking, our feelings.
Well, there's two angles that you've given to that. One is that this AI, these programs are our employees, and that now, for example, you say at Google, the programs are the employees, right, and humans supervise. On the other hand, you talk about the microbiome, and then the humans are the stomach.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we always try to catch, reality is always greater than the metaphors we use to try to catch it in.
Well, that's another thing I wanted to talk to you about, metaphors. I think metaphors are the way we define how we see the world and how we interact with the world. And I think that metaphors evolve over time in our culture. How do you see metaphors having evolved in the last even 20 years and how they're affecting? I mean, back 50 years ago, we had a machine, a mechanistic metaphor and model. And now we don't. We have something that's very different. I think about, there's a top-down metaphor, there's a bottom-up metaphor that I've explored. But you've looked at this whole world of technology. Where do you see the metaphors moving and shaping the way we see the world and interact with the world?
Well, I think the fundamental thing we have to begin with is the idea that the map is not the territory. That's this idea from Alfred Korzybski. Our metaphors are not reality, they're a description of reality. Do they help us to see something or do they not? We have to understand that they are not true. They're not something that, when when you hold a map, you realize it's a picture of the world, it's not the world. A metaphor is a picture of the world. It's not the world. Yeah, you have to get that.
The metaphors are the top-down processes that we use in order to filter the raw bottom-up.
That's right.
That comes into our consciousness.
Yeah.
Hence, they define and specify what we look at and how we see what we're experiencing.
That's right. And in fact, one of the things I talk a little bit about in the book is how do you develop the skill of not getting too tightly wedded to your maps, your metaphors, and start to sit and look at reality. As Wallace Stevens says again, reality is the beginning, not the end. The naked alpha, not the hierophant omega.
How do you do that?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, part of it is, first of all, you become aware of the consciousness of abstraction. You can actually, just notice, oh, wait, that's, a map. Okay, let me look and see, does the map match what I'm seeing? What's left out? And I kind of try to tell some stories in the book of when I did that. So here's this map of free software that was based around a set of particular programs, which was associated with this group called the Free Software Foundation. They had a political agenda. They had identified a canonical set of programs that they said, this is free software. And I said, well, why isn't the World Wide Web in the list? It was put in the public domain. Why isn't, all the stuff that came out of UC Berkeley that kind of gave rise to the internet, like the domain name system? Why isn't that on the list? Because it didn't have the same license. And I said, so there I was able to, through this process of the consciousness of abstraction, to say, oh, their guiding abstraction is a particular software license. And there's another set of things that use a different software license but have many other characteristics. So then I drew a different map. And I said, no, actually, guess what? This isn't about the battle against proprietary software and Linux versus Microsoft. It's about how does making software free and open source enable new things. And guess what? We have this great use case over here. My map is telling me, look at Google, look at the internet. Can you hold on one moment?
Okay, I'll do a station ID. This is the Rob Call Bottom Up Show.
I'm running about 15 minutes late on a podcast that I'm recording. I'm so sorry.
And I'll fill in the station ID.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
We started late. I had to, yeah.
So, one of those maxims that you give in bold in your book is that if the future is here already, but it's not evenly distributed yet. And the trick is to find seeds of that future and study them and ask yourself things about how they'll be different and when they're normal. I think this is part of this way of changing the way you look at things. How do you see a seed of the future? What's an example of a seed of the future that's already here?
Well, I give a lot of them in the book by looking backwards. But, like a contemporary one, that I spend a lot of time with is this sort of on-demand applications like Uber and Lyft. I go, okay, we have a sense, so we have this cognitive superpower enabled by sensors in our phones, the ability to summon things, the ability to know where people are. Well, what else could that be applied to? That's sort of an example of a seed of the future. But or more importantly, you look at something really far out, like CRISPR-Cas9. You say, wow, we can actually do in vivo gene editing now. That's it's unbelievable. Like, if you want to talk about WTF technologies, and you go, okay, so guess what? There's already a group that is talking about bringing extinct species back to life. Like that's pretty damn, by basically, we can actually get information from fossils about the genome. We can edit the genome of, another bird to bring back the passenger pigeon. That's what they're trying to do. I go, that's a freaking news from the future. And you go, well, what else might happen when there's lots of gene editing?
Okay, so we're coming near the end of the interview. You say near the end of the book, work on stuff that matters. You've really thought about this, what matters, and I'll throw in a quote that you use from Nick Hanauer, solve the biggest problem you can. And then you list 4 different things that you should do.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that? What matters, and what's that list of 4 things?
Yeah, you're expecting me to remember what I wrote. I'm thinking of what you mean. The first thing was work on stuff that matters to you more than money. Second, which is really this idea that we have so many entrepreneurs who are way too focused on the payday and not on the thing they're trying to accomplish. Second one was create more value than you capture, which is this idea that You know, we have a lot of evidence that these rich, bottom-up, inclusive economies, you know, that I observe in tech, but other people like Luigi Zingales have written about this on a society-wide scale, are more vibrant and they work better. And when they become extractive, that is, people are trying to take more out than they put in or than they create, the system starts to break down. We watched, you know, I talk in the book about what I watched happen. Microsoft's ecosystem lost its vibrancy. You can make the case that the web is losing its vibrancy as Google is sucking the life out of it. Facebook is sucking the life out of it. You know, and we have to go, okay, well, there will be a new one, but you can also hope that those companies will do a better job of maintaining their ecosystem. So I'm trying to put some lessons there. You know, that phrase actually came originally in O'Reilly's history after some internet billionaire said, you know, he'd started his company with an O'Reilly book. And I said, well, great, we got $35, you got, you know, untold billions. That's actually a pretty good deal. You know, we created all this value. We're really proud of that. And, you know, I'm trying to think what else I've got on that list.
The long view. Number 3 is take the long view.
Yeah. Well, definitely, we've kind of talked about that. You know, you can't actually optimize for the short term. And then the fourth thing is I think, fight with things that are going to defeat you. You know.
Actually, 4 is aspire to be better tomorrow than you are today.
Yeah. Okay. Well. All right. Well, that's actually a good one. Okay. Yeah. I kind of have a bunch of sort of related and overlapping sources of wisdom. Yeah. On you know, in terms of aspiring to be better than you are today, I guess I've always sort of felt like, you know, we have to struggle to be better. It doesn't come naturally. And, you know, there's a really useful thing that entrepreneurs in particular can do is they can set new ideals for society. You know, for all that Google, I think has you know, not entirely lived up to their, you know, their "don't be evil," you know, statement. That was a very powerful statement, you know, for a company to say, we're going to try to do this. And you actually look and you say their most successful, you know, time has been when they've really lived up to it. When they said, we're not going to do that kind of display advertising that, you know, Yahoo is doing, that, you know, we're going to try to make ads useful. And then they did, you know, and then I think over time as they grew, and it's like that pressure of what I call the master algorithm of, you know, you must keep growing, you must keep generating more and more profits to please, you know, please Skynet, the rogue AI that is our financial markets. You know, they start saying, well, actually, we got to do display advertising after all. We can make it better. It'll be okay. Oh, well, this service is better if we just take the users. Yeah, sorry, we just had to put somebody out of business in order to do that. That's just capitalism. That's how it works. And everybody goes, well, Google's evil. You know.
Klein has said that growth is today's God.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask you to talk about algorithms, because it's such a big part of your book, and you cast great light on it. So tell us some of your thoughts about algorithms and where they fit into where we are and where we're going.
Yeah, you know, the thing that I try to get across, there's sort of a central, so there's a series of chapters in the book that are really around what we learn from companies like Google and Facebook about algorithms. And when I say algorithms, I'm talking about algorithmic systems that could range from, you know, simple program algorithms, you know, they're simple rules, business rules, all the way up to through big data to AI. You know, so I'm using the term very generally. But you're usually trying to optimize for something. You know, I mean, think about an AI, you know, image recognizer. It's trying to recognize an image. It wants to get. It knows that it wants to get better at it. You know,
really, where things are going is algorithms and AI are becoming one. Really.
Well, not entirely. I mean, there are, yes, AI will transform, I think, the wide range of algorithms, but it's super important, I think, not to get too obsessed with AI. Because, the thing that I really wanted people to take away was the idea that I use the image in the book that our algorithmic systems that are at places like Google or Facebook are a little bit like the genies of Arabian mythology. You always notice you get to give them 3 wishes, right? And in the stories, the person who's giving the wish doesn't think it through sufficiently well, and it goes haywire. Right? And we also saw this in Walt Disney's Fantasia. Mickey Mouse with the broomsticks, he steals his master's spell book, Sorcerer's Apprentice. He gets the broom to help fetch buckets of water, but somehow the spell produces first 1 broom, then 2 brooms, then 4 brooms, binary explosion. Before long, the castle's awash in water. He's desperately trying to, and I go, that's Mark Zuckerberg right now. It's like, okay, how do we stop, our algorithmic genie from doing what we asked it to do? We said, show people more of what they like. Keep reinforcing. It'll actually be a great advertising business. We'll bring people together. They didn't account for the fact that there'd be spammers who would manipulate this, inject fake news into the system, hyper-partisan stuff. That would also get amplified, and they're having to figure that out. So this idea that algorithms can go wrong, is kind of taught to us by Facebook and fake news. So I kind of start with sort of Google's efforts to optimize for search quality, then to Facebook's struggles with fake news, and then to our financial markets. And it's quite clear, our financial markets give a very clear algorithmic direction to companies, and it's optimize for profit, treat people as a cost to be eliminated. So why are we surprised that our economy is the way that it is? We're getting exactly the economy we asked for.
I did a number of interviews about the algorithms in economics during the collapse in 2008, 2009, and it was centralized algorithms for mortgage lending that basically produced the disaster that we had back then.
But to me, it's, again, I think it's a mistake to focus on, and this is maybe why using the term algorithm is wrong. The real point is, it's what did we ask the system to optimize for? And we have clearly asked, we have a theory, just like Facebook had a theory that optimizing for engagement with content would be really good for people. We had a theory that optimizing for share price, in the economy, and optimizing for corporate profits would be good for the economy as a whole. We now have plenty of evidence that it wasn't good for the economy as a whole, that there were all kinds of externalities we hadn't taken into account, and that basically companies said, well, get rid of people. They're clearly a cost. And of course, that's not sustainable over the long term. Because
what I really love about what you say about algorithms is you talk about how Google constantly is tweaking and adjusting.
That's right.
Using AI information, using big data.
Yeah.
And then you compare that to government and regulations. Google changes its regulations of its algorithms and how it does page rank and what have you, second by second. Then you look at latest, you talk about government, and they do it years at a time. They'll put a regulation into effect, and the changes could take years. And I would love to see some way that algorithmic, constantly changing, could be applied to government. Do you think that's ever possible?
Well, it's already happening, in small ways, mostly at the local level. You think about things like congestion pricing in London. That's algorithmic regulation of traffic. You think about, they've talked about applying it to parking. So there's things like that I think are, small steps. We have it in central banking, where they basically say we have an outcome we're trying to manage to, an inflation target, and we're going to, pump more money into the system, or we're going to raise interest rates, or they have a couple of knobs and levers, not as many as Google has. but they do have an idea where they go, the outcome is what matters, not the rule, not the actual rules. And we're going to periodically, when we say that the outcomes are getting out of whack, we're going to change the rules. And I think that that is a different approach, and I think we could use it in a lot more places. It is going to really be a very different kind of governance in the 21st century. And I think there's a lot of learning that needs to go back and forth between government and the tech world on that front. I don't think anybody knows how to do it yet.
You also talk about algorithmic scheduling of workers, and I think that's very interesting. And you propose a difference between the 1099 and the W-2 and benefits. I think that is a very exciting idea that you're proposing, and I just want to get it out there.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we again, this kind of goes back to this bad map idea. Everybody was sort of so focused on the on-demand economy and Uber, these, the drivers who are not really employees and don't have any benefits. And I went, well, guess what? Neither do most employees at, retailers or fast food. And the reason they don't is because there are these scheduling algorithms that have come into play so that people no longer have full-time work. And we have this system in which you get certain benefits if you're a full-time worker, and you get less benefit if you're a part-time worker. So companies have basically used these algorithmic scheduling systems to make sure that people don't get full-time work. And not only that,
this is not a small percentage of the workforce.
That's right. And so, you kind of go, oh, wow, our old systems that make this distinction between full-time and part-time, between W-2 and 1099, don't actually fit reality anymore. They're a bad map. And we need to make a new map that says, okay, there's a flexible continuum of work. There are different ways of marshaling workers. That's fine. So in order to support that, 21st century marshaling of workers on demand as needed, we actually need flexible scheduling that empowers workers to figure out when they're going to work and when they want to work. We need portable benefits that mean that you don't have some arbitrary distinction that says, well, if you work full-time all the time for one company, you get this big level of social benefit. And if you work part-time on a contingent basis, you get a much smaller social safety net, or none at all. You go, no, we clearly can track. You work 5 hours here, an hour here, 20 hours here. Everybody pays in proportion to what percentage of your income they provide. I think, we already do that for Social Security. We could do it for other social benefits too. And, we actually, if we can track the hours, if we can manage the hours, we can track and manage the benefits independent of who they come from. And that would be a really interesting, policy approach to all this going on.
And I think we need to just get wrapping. Anything you want to finish up with, a final message for listeners, viewers?
Yeah, I would just sort of say that it's really important to take the long view on technological change. It takes longer for change to happen than people think, and we compress our view of the past. We kind of don't get that it was, between, take this sort of industrial revolution. I think about fabric mills because my mom grew up behind Lister's mill, which was the largest silk mill in the world at one point in Bradford, England. And, the peak mills of the 1840s, when, there were like, like making fabric was one of the great industries of the world. And, but you look back, it's like 80 years from the spinning jenny, and the beginning of the first mechanized, weaving machines. You go, well, 80 years here, but it wasn't, that's slow, whatever. You go, well, computing is also slow. When did we have the first digital computers? 1944, 1945, So we're about 70 years into this computer revolution. And we're just now really starting to get into that peak digitalization where it's really affecting the economy. And so genome sequencing is, much more recent. That's kind of on its 50, 60-year cycle. I mean, we have this idea that, we can see this little, piece that seems to be moving really fast. But hey, even the World Wide Web is, heading for 30 years old. We're now, 10 years into the smartphone, 20, plus years into the mobile phone. So I guess I feel like so you got to watch this stuff over time and then kind of ask yourself, okay, if this were the Industrial Revolution, where would we be? If this were electrification, where would we be? If this were the automobile, where would we be in the cycle? And it gives you kind of a sense of the arc. And of course, it also gives you that wonderful sense, what the ancients called memento mori, the knowledge of death. The fact that, Buffalo, because of its proximity to Niagara Falls, was once the epicenter of electrification, right? It was the Silicon Valley of its day, right? And Silicon Valley, people will look on one day and say, wow, this is once a place that was really rich, and now it's Detroit, or whatever.
Jack Dorsey said that he wanted to see Twitter to become a utility. And Clay Shirky said, you really can't tell that a technology is mature until your mother takes it for granted. And I think it's kind of what you're describing, the maturation of a technology.
Yeah.
So what do you think is going to happen what are the next ones to start reaching those maturity, those utilities?
Oh, I think all of the things that we use today, because guess what? We are somebody's mother or father, and, by that measure, for kids today, Facebook is already the thing that their mother or father are comfortable with that they think is no longer cool.
That's true.
So it's separating yourself from your moment in history, separating yourself from the maps and the ideas that frame how you see the world is a really useful exercise, and I kind of try to show it here. You go, oh, wait, yeah, we are the mother that somebody thinks is like, kind of so quaint.
Okay. You've been listening to Tim OReilly, a pioneer of internet technology, computer technology. He's got a new book out, WTF, What the Future, and it's up to us. Thanks so much, Tim. It's been a
Thanks, Rob. Really appreciate it.